the OrthoPAC, hosted by Sam Dyer. Welcome to the OrthoPAC, where we discuss up-to-date orthopedic topics for the busy clinician. I invite you to sit back and relax as I attempt to fill in the gaps between education, current events, and real-world practice.
Today, I'd like to welcome attorneys Sara Lincoln and Scott Addison. Sara, thanks. You provided a little segue to part 2 of this about malpractice claims and insurance. I was hoping we could talk a little bit about that. A lot of PAs don't really know this. They don't really know they know that their practice carries malpractice insurance, but they don't really know much about it at all. And I think that needs to be known. Can you help us understand the differences, say, in occurrence policy versus claims made, tail coverage? What can you tell us about that?
I would say PAs are not the only ones who really don't understand. Physicians don't understand their malpractice coverage either. So this is not something that is unique to your particular listener group. It is absolutely something that we find all the time, which is why it's really important, not so much that you know and understand your coverages, but that you know and understand who within your organization you can go to ask about it and to make sure that you are getting the most value that you can get out of the premiums that you're paying. Whether you're a nurse practitioner, PA, physician, it doesn't matter. So, if you're in a practice that doesn't have an in-house counsel, then you want to know who's your CEO, your chief operating officer, or your president of your organization. Or if you just know that you have malpractice coverage and you know who your carrier is, it doesn't cost anything for you to call the carrier and ask a question. It doesn't cost anything for you to get that advice from them. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're making a claim, which I know a lot of people are worried about. If I make a claim, then my premiums are going to go up. That isn't always the case. And you don't have to make a claim just because you're calling your carrier to ask a question. The only other coverage that you need to be aware of that's under your malpractice coverage is not just if a claim is made against you, but, for example, what we talked about earlier, if you're asked to give a deposition in a workers' compensation action or a personal injury case, or you get a medical board complaint against you or an inquiry from some other regulatory body like the nursing board. There are coverages under most malpractice policies today that allow you to get representation under those circumstances. It can be called medical defense coverage. Some carriers call it broad regulatory D coverage. It's going to vary what they call it, but usually they will provide legal representation to you at no cost to you unless you have a deductible, which most big medical practices don't have, to help you in responding to those things.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the occurrence policies and the claims made policies. So occurrence means that when you purchase a policy of insurance, it will cover you for a period of time if the adverse event happens during that period. The occurrence of the event is during the policy period. The claims made is a policy that covers you whenever a claim is made against you, regardless of when the underlying issue occurred. So, if your policy covered, say, the policy year of the year 2020, and a claim is made against you this year, then your policy would cover you, and that would include events that happened in 2019 or 2018 or earlier. Whereas if it's occurrence policy for something that happened in 2019, whatever policy that you have in place that covered that year would be the one that covered you. Tail coverage simply provides additional coverage after you leave a particular employer and move on somewhere else, and you get additional coverage in case a claim is made after you have left, and can help cover any exposure or any cost of defense.
Mm-hmm. One other thing for our listeners to take into account when you're looking at the job, not all practices will pay your tail coverage with claims made policies. You want to make sure that's in your contract, because I can tell you from well, not my personal experience, but knowing a lot of people that have had this, it could be several $1,000s and, as much as 10,000 or more for tail coverage. So you really want that to be in your contract. You want your practice to pay for that. You don't want to have to pay for that if you go somewhere else. So I did some charity work at a community health center a couple of years ago, and our practice, because I was not working under the orthopedics, wouldn't cover me there, and I couldn't be an employee there because it's a government thing. So I had to buy my own malpractice coverage that was limited to that kind of work. But I've also heard of PAs practicing to either supplement their own practice policy, or they don't feel like they have enough. I don't know. I mean, what do you think about that? Do PAs really need to have that much coverage, or does it just depend on what their malpractice is with their work?
Yeah, this will be a great lawyer answer. It depends.
Good.
It really depends. So for a really large practice, I would anticipate that the available coverage under any claim is likely going to be sufficient to cover your potential exposure for the claim at issue. I wouldn't expect that if you're with a large practice that you need additional coverage on top of what your practice already provides to you. So the circumstance that you're talking about where you're volunteering at a community health center or something like that, that would be a reason for a PA to have their own independent coverage. Otherwise, there really isn't a good reason for a PA to need their own coverage. If they're practicing within a group that provides that, you need to make sure that if you are in a group and you have hospital credentials, that your coverage in whatever practice you're in is at the correct level to satisfy your credentialing requirements at any facility where you're credentialed. And if it does, then you're probably good. You don't need to get your own. And frankly, nobody really can find out if you have your own coverage until after a lawsuit is filed against you. So it's not something that is just generally publicly known that you have additional coverage.
You're talking about lawsuits and getting named and whether you have coverage. The plaintiffs are also going to name your employer. It doesn't really help necessarily to get another layer of coverage for yourself because there's already a built-in additional layer that your employer typically has. In most cases, if they name the PA, they would likely also name the practice, and in some cases would name a supervising physician in order to get 3 layers of coverage potentially. So that, of course, assumes, like Sara said, that the practice is able to provide the coverage. But that's been our experience. It's not usually necessary unless, like you said, there's specific reasons why.
PAs, as you know, can change professions and say, I'm coming from the ER and I want to work in orthopedics. And I'm looking at their benefits of the practice, and one of the benefits is malpractice coverage, or at least they list that. Is there anything that I should be looking at? I know, Sara, you said earlier that typically big groups will have coverage. Is there anything that I should look at or ask my CEO or whoever's interviewing me about the limits of the malpractice? Now, we already talked about the tail coverage, make sure that's in it, but anything we should be thinking about with that?
I think it's always important that you know the amount of the coverage. And again, you want to make sure that you know that is sufficient for any facilities where you're going to want to try and get credentials for that particular practice if you're going into the hospitals. The other thing that I would probably really encourage people to look at is whether or not you have a consent to settle clause in your policy. Most insurance carriers for independently owned medical practices have what's called a consent to settle clause in their policy. Most big hospital systems or practices that are owned by hospital systems do not have consent to settle clauses in their policies. And so that impacts you when a decision is made that a case that you get involved in needs to be settled. And when cases get settled, that then implicates reporting requirements both to the National Practitioner Data Bank as well as to the state where you're licensed to practice medicine, or at least here in North Carolina, that's true. I'm licensed only in North Carolina, so my comments apply here. And those reporting requirements become important because anytime that you apply for privileges at a hospital, the hospital is going to query the National Practitioner Data Bank to find out if you have ever had a case settled in your name. Likewise, anytime a settlement gets reported to the North Carolina Medical Board, they then conduct an investigation to determine whether or not they should be taking any action against your license as a result of the complaint or the care that was provided that resulted in the settlement of the lawsuit. So it's something that you would probably like to have some control over in terms of deciding whether or not to settle a case.
The consent to settle clause. I need to read about that myself, so thank you for letting us know that.
I would also just reiterate the medical defense coverage in a lot of policies. We have seen over the years an increase in the number of complaints to the medical board because there is no barrier to that. Anybody can file a complaint to the medical board. And so it definitely behooves you to get assistance when dealing with the medical board. And if you have coverage for that, then all the better. So would definitely recommend folks ensure that coverage includes that type of assistance.
I appreciate your taking time. This is going to be very helpful for our listeners.
Thanks, Sam.
That'd be great.
Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Sam. We appreciate it.
All right, you guys take care. Thank you for joining the OrthoPAC podcast. Please follow the Physician Assistants in Orthopaedic Surgery on social media. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Please subscribe to our podcast. If this has been helpful, please take a moment to leave a review.